Well, Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us now from Sydney in Australia. Antony, I want to ask you about some numbers we've seen out of recent polling in Israel. When asked whether they support the transfer, for instance, of humanitarian aid to residents in Gaza, some 68% of Jewish respondents said no. 85% of Arab respondents said yes. This, as children are literally dying of starvation, and we see northern Gaza on the brink of famine. What should we make of that?
This really goes to the heart of something that many of us have been saying for years, long before October 7, which is a real radicalization of Israeli Jewish society. And I would argue, in fact, many in the Jewish diaspora, and I speak as someone Jewish myself, but the Jewish diaspora in some places have similar views, that this real decades-long campaign to dehumanize Palestinians, to not view them as equal, and this is reflected in much of the Israeli press since October 7. So with some notable exceptions, the vast bulk of the Israeli media, it's very much akin to the US media after 9/11. Wall-to-wall, hardline patriotism, nationalism, hatred of Arabs, hatred of Palestinians, and the idea of a Palestinian starving literally down the road. I mean, most people might not realise, if you live in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, you're like an hour away from Gaza. It really, I think, speaks to a culture within Israel which makes any kind of peace with Palestinians in the short term, frankly, impossible.
So do you then think that there is actually an accurate understanding in Israel of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but because of the narrative that's been shared, people simply don't care?
I think people are willfully ignorant. There are some people who know. There are certainly Israelis who are campaigning on the streets to end the war, to get food in. That's a tiny, sadly, tiny minority. But many Israelis, and this is based on those polls you suggested, and there are many others, including polls that advocated for forcible ethnic cleansing of Palestinians out of Gaza. These are polls taken after October 7. I think show that, sadly, the majority of Israeli Jews do not care, which is, apart from the immorality of that position, it's also insanely ridiculous and self-interested reasons, because none of this is making Israelis safer. When this war ends, hopefully as soon as possible, this will make Israelis more unsafe. I mean, this 5+ months of genocidal violence against Palestinians has made all Israelis more unsafe. So it's completely counterproductive and immoral and shameful as someone Jewish that these are the values that so many fellow Jewish people have.
I see a majority of Israelis polled in that survey also said that they don't actually believe the so-called absolute victory that Israel wants is actually likely. Do you think that the planned Rafah offensive and what all observers are saying would be a civilian bloodbath, would that change anything?
Look, ultimately, what Israel and the Israeli military have been trying to do since October 7 is to regain some kind of so-called credibility. And what I mean by that is that October 7 was an intelligence military catastrophe for Israel, quite clearly. And what they're trying to do now is to build on the last 5 months of utter destruction to convince a quite sceptical Israeli public. Although that public supports the war continuing, to be clear, they are sceptical, rightly, that you can militarily destroy Hamas. I mean, we've seen in various parts of Gaza where the Israeli military has been in the last months, Hamas reappearing. Of course, that's the case. As the US found in Iraq and Afghanistan, to its great detriment, over years, unless you have seemingly millions of troops occupying a land indefinitely, you cannot, inverted commas, successfully occupy a different territory. It's impossible, because Palestinians rightly are angry, are upset, are literally dying from starvation. So, yeah, it's a really ugly situation that I think too many Israelis do not want to see.
Will you say that Israel isn't acting in its, well, to create more self-interest, and Israelis don't necessarily understand that? It does feel like we're seeing increasing polarization along ethnic lines within Israel. Does the prospect perhaps of further international isolation then change anything?
Look, the question is, what does that isolation actually mean? I mean, ultimately, we hear greater rhetoric from European leaders, Canadian leaders and Biden, but ultimately, it's just words. These are not actions. The US is not stopping any kind of weapons transfers at all. In fact, they're really continuing to do so. So ultimately, I think this is really Israel, and the Israeli government feels like, at least thus far, there is no international isolation. There are many countries that oppose what's going on. Civil society in many countries is vehemently opposed, including growing numbers of Jews. But Israel is not an isolated country. In fact, one of the things I've been following for the last months is so many of the weapons that Israel is testing in Gaza are increasingly going to be sold to other nations around the world because they've been battle tested in Gaza. This is one way that Israel, in fact, it thinks it'll be less economically isolated.
Oh, that's very interesting. Antony Loewenstein there, an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory, speaking to us today from Sydney. Thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera, Antony.
Thank you so much.